Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed, Part 1, A Fortunate Grandchild. We are discussing her Aunt Rose. As far as I can judge at this distance of time, she took her religion, Orthodox Church of England, very seriously. She went regularly to St. Swithin's Church, and I have no doubt that much of her handwork went into the appreciative channels of church bazaars. She also ran the Sunday school attached to this church, although one might have thought that she saw quite enough of young children during the rest of the week. She organized the session admirably. Simple hymns and prayers alternated with handwork, making Moses in plasticine, for example, to put into a carefully woven cradle and hidden among dried sticks erected in a sand tray. There was quite a bit of marching, if I remember correctly, when we put our collection money into a box, whilst we sang, "See the farthings dropping, listen as they fall," or something very similar. The whole program was conducted with great skill and gusto by Aunt Rose, and I think she played the piano as well. Later, she and a friend, Miss Hetty Lee, collaborated on a useful manual for Sunday school teachers called Little Children of the Church, which incorporated these ideas and gave appropriate lessons and practical work for every Sunday in the year, thus giving small children a basic understanding of the great church festivals and the pattern of the Christian year. It was in print for many years. Aunt Rose's organizing ability was also to the fore in helping to arrange the mammoth fancy dress party which was held annually at Goldsmiths College, New Cross. I suppose it was in aid of some deserving cause. My sister and I, never great ones for pleasure en masse, rather dreaded these occasions when we were tricked out as shepherdesses or nursery rhyme characters in costumes made by my hard-working Aunt Jess. I heartily loathed all my regalia on these occasions, and pined to go as a powder puff, with a fetching little round hat trimmed with swan's down, in common with dozens of other 6-year-olds. But I never attained this ambition. The nadir of the evening, in our eyes, was the grand parade, when we marched 2 by 2 round and round the enormous hall, surveyed by fond parents and the judges on the stage. Aunt Rose, aglow with pearl and satin, beamed proudly upon us as we passed. The refreshments were always superb, and I rather think we were all given a present at the end of the evening. Even so, we were jolly glad it was all over for another year. A certain amount of entertaining was done under Grandma Reed's roof, and I think Aunt Rose instigated much of it. I can remember a number of young soldiers, usually connected in some way with St. Swithin's, enjoying tea there. From one, when I was 3, I received my first proposal of marriage, or at least an understanding, but he was one of the many who never returned. His name was Revelry Brown, although this spelling is phonetic, as I never saw it written. Another young soldier married an older cousin. Sometimes 1 or 2 of the clergy came to 267, and a frequent visitor was an old sailor called Maskell, who had been with Perry on his Arctic expedition early in the century. I imagine that some of Aunt Rose's teaching colleagues also visited the house, but I do not remember seeing them. No doubt I was then abed. The journey to school, at least in the early days, always seems to have had Aunt Rose as a guardian angel. I was glad of this for several reasons. Quite often we saw the cat's meat man, who drove a little gig in which were numberless wooden skewers threaded with slices of cooked horse meat. He had a raucous voice to advertise his wares, and cat owners would run out with their pennies. Naturally, the cats came too when they heard the welcoming cries. I adored cats, and still do, and for some unaccountable reason I thought a cat's meat man collected the cats, killed and cooked them, and loaded his wooden skewers so that he could entice more to their brother's gruesome feast. No doubt someone told me that the provender was horseflesh, and I had not listened, or more likely I never confessed my awful anxieties on behalf of the trusting cats which followed the little cart. It was good to have Aunt Rose's hand to hold. There was also a railway bridge across the road we traversed, and the rumbling of trains overhead terrified me. It was only a matter of time, I felt sure, before one fell through the bridge and engulfed us all in a horrifying chaos. Quite a number of bombs fell in that part of London in the First World War. Aiming for Woolwich Arsenal, said the know-alls. I certainly recall passing a great crater in St. Swithin's churchyard after a night raid, and the piles of sandbags round the school walls to protect us from the blast. We were too young to be frightened much, but it was a comfort to have Aunt Rose's company. She remained a linchpin of the family for many years. No wedding, funeral, or other function was complete without Aunt Rose to the fore. Despite her little affectations, which irritated us inordinately as we grew into our teens, she was an admirable woman, hard-working, shrewd, bountifully fond of children, and interested in everything. She long outlived her younger sisters and was in her 80s when she died. Uncle Harry. My Uncle Harry, though resident at Grandma Reed's, lived in a world of his own. I don't think that I have ever met anyone quite so dreamily abstracted as this diminutive uncle. It was G.K. Chesterton, I think, who pointed out that absence of mind meant presence of mind elsewhere. This was so, I imagine, in Uncle Harry's case. He was absorbed in two subjects. The Young Men's Christian Association was one, and some sect which believed that the future was foretold by the hieroglyphics on the pyramids. The tribes of Israel also figured in this doctrine, and Uncle Harry was a dedicated believer. His job was something to do with the newspaper world on the printing side. He went daily to Fleet Street, as far as I recollect, to the News of the World. I know that one day he took us to his place of work, which was incredibly noisy but fascinating, and my sister and I were presented with miniature copies of the paper, which we treasured. I suppose that he had some modest routine job, which he accomplished quite satisfactorily, as he was never sacked, and which enabled his mind to rove happily over the two subjects dearest to his heart. He was a tiny man with brown, dreamy eyes and an enormous walrus mustache. We hated receiving Uncle Harry's damp and fumbling kisses, and did our best to dodge them, although our mischievous father inevitably prompted us to our reluctantly undertaken duty. Left alone, I don't think Uncle Harry would have noticed our presence, and the part he played in my grandma's house was a minor one. However, when pressed at family parties, he was public-spirited enough to sing Little Annie Rooney, his one-party piece, after Aunt Rose had obliged with Hark, Hark the Lark in a tremulous soprano. As girls, my sister and I mimicked Aunt Rose in action. Now, I confess, I sound exactly the same when I take to song. Uncle Harry wore neat dark suits, but what I found most intriguing were elastic armbands made of metal, which he wore above his elbows over his shirt sleeves. I suppose it was difficult for such a little man to buy small enough shirts. The armbands were snapped off when he changed and were left on the dressing table. Sometimes I was allowed to play with them in Uncle Harry's absence. No doubt he had forgotten to put them on these happy occasions. He was a tireless worker for the local branch of the YMCA, and I remember going to a fete to raise funds for this good cause. The chief attraction to me was a wooden bust of a black at the entrance. He was holding out a black hand on which one put a coin. Immediately the hand came up to the widely grinning mouth, and the coin was gulped down. I badgered Uncle Harry until he showed me the lever at the back which controlled this miracle. I have had a soft spot for the YMCA ever since. He had a small bedroom on the first floor of 267, overlooking the garden. It was very plain and neat, kept so, I have no doubt, by hard-working Aunt Jess, and the only ornament that I can remember was a china bust of a jester in cap and bells. This little figurine was reversible. On one side, the jester leant back, the silent bells shaken back from his laughing face, a picture of well-fed happiness. On the reverse side, the bells hung around a doleful face with a pursed mouth and many wrinkles. I coveted this ornament, but was only allowed to hold it occasionally, and then over Uncle Harry's white counterpane, in case it broke. Grandma Reed and the rest of the family seemed to treat Uncle Harry with a tender indulgence given to a backward child. I doubt if he was ever asked to undertake any matter of responsibility in case he forgot it. On the other hand, despite his apparent vagueness, he was no fool, and when finally he became the one man in the household, which was set up with Aunt Jess and Aunt Lizzie after Grandma's death, he probably emerged as a much more capable man than he had appeared when overprotected by his mother, Aunt Jess and Aunt Rose. 267 Hither Green Lane. If Uncle Harry's room made little impression on a young child, apart from the china jester and the occasional bonus of Uncle Harry's elasticated armbands, the rest of the house certainly made up for it. It was built of red bricks and had a bay window and a slate roof. I imagine it was erected in late Victorian times and was solidly built. There was a small front garden in which I vaguely remember London Pride growing in a narrow border. There was also a thriving Cassandra shrub which climbed over the front of the house and had masses of scarlet berries in the autumn. At my urgent request, Aunt Jess risked life and limb during this season by hanging out of the bedroom window with a pair of scissors and cutting off branches for me, as I waited below so that I could take them to school to adorn our classroom. There was also a fascinating round metal lid in the front path which the coal man could fill up. He shot his sacks of coal down the chute here, and the thunderous rumbling mass fell straight into the coal cellar which ran under the hall of the house. Access to this terrifying place was by means of a few steps down from a door immediately outside the kitchen. An enamel candlestick and a box of matches stood on a shelf just inside, and by this wavering light the cavern could be explored. There were recesses on the right-hand side which once held bottles of wine, no doubt, but I can't think that Grandma had many of those in store there. From the front door, the hall seemed long to a child. My sister, when about 6 years old, used to wait in silent dread for the aunts to send her to the front door to collect the evening paper which had been thrust through the letterbox. She was convinced that the Kaiser himself, complete with waxed mustache and spiked helmet, was lurking behind the heavy curtain on the first landing. It was only a matter of time before he came thundering down the stairs to catch her before she regained the safety of the kitchen. Grandma Reed and the two aunts naturally had no idea of this nightly torture, and when years later my sister confessed, they were stricken with remorse, poor dears. The doors opened from the hall on the left. The first led into Grandma's drawing room, and the second into the dining room directly behind it. The drawing room was a great favorite of mine. It had so many attractive things in it. The furniture was upholstered in red plush, and there was a matching red carpet on the floor. Iridescent conch shells stood on the marble mantelpiece, and there was a fascinating bead fire screen which was attached by a brass contraption to the mantel shelf. The screen was composed of tiny beads depicting arum lilies on a green background of leaves. 2 heavy gold tassels hung at each corner, and the whole thing seemed beautiful to me. The piano was much used, as I have mentioned. It was an upright model, and some of Aunt Rose's handiwork, I suspect, appeared on its top in the form of a black satin runner embroidered with pink and red braid. Some of her pictures adorned the walls, and in brackets on each side of the overmantel were tufts of dried blue statice. A small octagonal table stood in the center of the room, and this was inlaid with a pattern of ivy leaves. Another black satin mat, suitably embellished by Aunt Rose, stood in the middle of this table, on which a potted fern was sometimes lodged. Double doors behind the red plush sofa folded back to give access to the dining room. This was done at Christmas time or at weddings or other family occasions. Above the double doors, flat against the wall, was a green glass walking stick suspended there by 2 ribbons. I should have liked to have played with it, as well as the conch shells and some china cherubs which sported themselves on top of the piano. No nonsense here about having the lid open. But I was not allowed to handle Grandma's treasures, at least not when her eye was upon me. Years later, I described this room in a book called The Market Square, where a prosperous Caxley ironmonger called Bender North was to be found taking his ease after the shop was closed down in his splendid drawing room. A gas fire warmed this room, and another heated the dining room. Before each stood a small dish of water to purify the air, I was told. The dining room was rather dark and was furnished with a long mahogany table surrounded by heavily built mahogany chairs, upholstered in some shiny black material which was probably American cloth. In one corner was a rather handsome piece of furniture in which was kept the best glass and china. Its name appealed to me, and I liked to hear Grandma directing Aunt Jess to bring something from the chiffonier. I have just looked up chiffonnier in the Oxford Dictionary and see that it is described as a movable low cupboard with a sideboard top. But I don't think Grandma's specimen could have been moved very often, as it was stuffed with heavy breakables. A conservatory opened out from the dining room with a door from it into the garden. On family occasions, such as weddings, the children were settled in there at bamboo tables covered with starched linen cloths, at liberty to drop their crumbs on the tiled floor without being scolded. I remember we had fairy lights strung in there at once. These were little glass jars, rather like fish paste jars, in different colors and glowing from a small candle or night light placed inside. The first flight of stairs from the hall ended in two heavy dark curtains which had to be drawn aside on large brass rings to disclose a landing where Grandma's bedroom lay ahead, at the back of the house, over the kitchen and scullery, and the lavatory and bathroom stood on the left. It was behind these curtains that my quaking sister imagined the Kaiser lay in wait for her. The bath was encased in wood, and so was the wash basin in the corner with its brass taps above it. It was rather a dark room, and the small window was either of frosted glass or covered with that patterned oiled paper beloved of Victorians, which ensured complete privacy. The lavatory next door was equally gloomy, and I seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time there after breakfast at my aunt's urgent promptings to "try, dear." However, it was quite peaceful, and I swung my short legs and let my mind drift very happily, successfully ignoring the growing agitation of my two aunts as the clock's hands crept inexorably forward and my mission proved in vain. I can never remember Grandma Reed getting in the least perturbed by all this fuss. After 12 children, she had become philosophical, no doubt, about such transient things. Grandma Reed's bedroom was probably the one best known to me, as it was here that I was put for my afternoon rest in preschool or holiday times. Here I was divested of my pinafore frock and shoes, and tucked up under the eiderdown in just my vest, liberty bodice, chemise, knickers edged with cotton crochet work, which left a delightful pattern on one's thighs, petticoat, and socks. It was usually Aunt Jess who performed this task, and before she departed downstairs, I would plead with her to let me have a china ornament from the mantelpiece. It portrayed a little girl in a sprigged skirt accompanied by a dog, and I loved to take it to bed with me. As dear Aunt Jess was putty in my hands, I invariably won, and the pretty thing was given to me with many cautions about taking great care not to drop it, or "what will Grandma say?" I knew better than to ask my grandma for it on the rare occasions when she put me to rest. She would give me her wonderful smile, a quick kiss, a brisk "no," and that would be that. As soon as Aunt Jess had gone, I got out of bed, china ornament in hand, and explored the room. Grandma's dressing table, complete with 7 or 8 little lace mats and a runner, called collectively a Duchesse set, had such entrancing things as scent bottles, hair brushes, combs, powder jars, and so on, which I investigated thoroughly. There was also a cone-like object hanging by a ribbon from the mirror's knob called a hair tidy. It was the same shape as the paper cone which the grocer whipped up from a flat piece of thick blue paper on the counter, ready for filling with sugar from a scoop. I usually examined the contents of the small drawers during rest time. The larger ones were too heavy to pull out. The little drawers held trinkets, small hair combs, little pots of face cream, nail scissors, and the like. I enjoyed combing my own hair and then the fringe of Grandma's hearth rug with her largest comb, and was sorely tempted to undo the end of the pink and blue stitching which bound Grandma's blankets. If you worked hard, it was possible to make a dear little ball of pink or blue wool when it had all unraveled. But my mother had not been pleased when my sister and I presented her with the fruits of our labors, and I never risked it with Grandma's blankets, much as I should have enjoyed this innocent pastime. The bedroom window looked out over the back garden. There was nothing much of excitement in it, although at one stage Aunt Rose kept some hens there, and one afternoon a resourceful young cousin, aged 2, successfully painted the runs and the less agile chickens pale blue. The garden next door, however, was a miracle of neatness. Small clipped box hedges surrounding the garden beds. Here Eileen lived, a most beautiful child, and to me a big girl of about 7. She was as immaculate as the garden, dressed in white with fair ringlets and a stunning doll's pram, which she pushed happily round and round the paths. Her white buckskin boots never appeared soiled, her clothes were unsullied, she had a charming smile and pretty manners. If Eileen were there to look at during my rest hour, my happiness was complete, and I would watch her as I sucked the China girl's head and hope that she would look up and wave at me. The top half of Grandma's door to the landing was made of glass, and in each corner was a pane of colored glass with an engraved star in the middle. The top 2, of course, were beyond my reach, but one ruby red pane and one dark blue in the bottom half afforded me infinite pleasure. How enthralling to see the landing wardrobe, and, if the curtains were pulled back, the whole of the first flight of stair, the hall stand, and the front door, glowing redly as if about to burst into flames. Equally enjoyable, with one eye pressed to the blue pane, was the same view plunged into mysterious gloom. Often, when busily experimenting with these sublime colors, Aunt Jess would appear at the foot of the stairs, red as the winter sun or murky as an underwater mermaid, and I knew it was time to fly back to bed and pull up the eiderdown. "Had a nice rest, darling," she would say. I always had. We will explore the house a little further next time.